Okay, good. Parshas Bechukosai. So, we've got four items to cover. I've tried to find ideas that I heard from Rabbi Pinchas Robert. Sadly, we had the news last Motzei Shabbos that he had passed away. One of the legendary figures here, Rabbonim here in London. And I thought we'd try and find some ideas either that I heard from him or that somehow connect to him. The first idea I saw in his Sefer, and it's very appropriate for him. The pasuk says, "In Bechukosai telechu ves mitzvosai tishmru vasisem oisam." This is the beginning, their famous opening of this week's Parsha. If you listen to my statutes and keep my mitzvahs, vasisem osam, and do them. Now there's a medrash, interesting medrash, which Rabbi Roberts quotes in his Sefer. He says, the medrash says in Vayikra Rabbah, Omer David, Ribono shel Olam, b'chol yom, and every single day, he used to say, that David HaMelech would say that I would intend to go to such and such a place when I woke up in the morning. This is what I'm going to do today. But my feet took me to the Beis HaKnesses and to the Beis HaMedrash. End of Medrash. It seems a very strange Medrash. The suggestion of the Medrash seems to be that David HaMelech's plans always misfired. He had plans to go to places X, Y, and Z, but he never ended up arriving at his destination. His feet just took him elsewhere. It seems a very strange comment of the Medrash. Now, Rabbi Roberts' explanation of this is this. People think that Torah relates to the world of the spiritual and has no bearing on the physical. And therefore, a person can be sitting, a leader of the generation, a great Talmid Chacham, can be sitting in his room learning Torah, but he's not really connected to the physical world, to the physical reality. But that is very far from the truth, because it's Torah which basically guides us and directs every aspect of our lives. They tell an interesting anecdote. It was Moshe Sher, I think, that one time he had an audience with President Kennedy. And it fell out on Tisha B'Av. And he asked Rabbi Aaron Kotler whether he should shave or not. After 3 weeks, and he needs to see the president, so it's an important meeting. Should he shave? And I think Rabbi Aaron directed him to Moshe Feinstein to how to deal with that. But Rabbi Aaron Kotler prepared Moshe Sher for this meeting. And he sat with him, I think, for an hour and a half. And he explained to him all the questions that will come up. And he basically briefed him fully. And here was a man who was, the great Rosh Hashiva, didn't, read the newspapers, didn't access information in the way other people did. And yet, Moshe Sher said, when he was sitting in the room with, I think, 10, a dozen, 15 people, he said all the questions, everyone else, he was the best prepared. All the questions that the president was asking, these were the ones that Rabbi Aaron anticipated. And he was the best briefed. It's often the Torah which guides a person's life, and those Yechidei Skula, those people who are Omel in Torah, they have the ability to tap into aspects of Torah which is going to help them guide the generation. And that's exactly what it says in the Gemara Megillah. Anyone who learns halachas every day is guaranteed to go to the world to come. Shenemar halichos olam lo. I think it's pasuk in Chavakuk. Halichos olam lo, which means that the ways of the world are His, HaKadosh Baruch Hu's. Al tikra halichos ela halachas. The idea is that the ways of the world are halachas. If you want to access how HaKadosh Baruch Hu runs the world, learn Torah. And that's exactly what the Gemara in Bracha says. An amazing Gemara at the beginning of Brachas, Gimel Amud Beis. Kinnor hoyotolu l'malam mitosah shel David. David HaMelech had a harp sort of hanging over his bed. He left the window open. Kivin shegiach chatzos laila, when it became midnight, bo ruach tzefonis, the midnight, the northern wind blew. V'nosheves bo, and it blew the harp. It sort of made it play. U'menagein me'elov, and the harp started playing. Miyad hoya oimed va'osik b'Torah, and that was his alarm clock. He woke up at midnight. Ad she'olod amat hashachar, until it came to daybreak, until it came to dawn. Kivin she'olo amat hashachar nichnesu chachmei Yisrael etzlo. The sages of the Jewish people came into David HaMelech. Amruloi Adonenu HaMelech, we need your guidance. Help lead the Jewish people. And he gives example, Amchi Yisrael tzrichim parnasa, etc., etc. What does that mean? how was David HaMelech able to guide and to lead and to make decisions? Because he had woken up at midnight and he had spent, the 5-6 hours before dawn learning Torah, and that gave him the clarity of mind in the Das Torah and the inspiration to be able to guide and to lead Klal Yisrael. That's the point. And therefore, that's what the Medrash means. David HaMelech says, "B'chol yom v'yom ho'yisi mechashev v'omer l'makom ploni u'beis dira ploni sani ho'ilech." But my feet brought me to the Beis HaKnesset, the Beis HaMedrash. What does that mean? So Rabbi Roberts explained what it means is this. He knew that he had to make decisions to lead the people. That was his job, he's the king. But how do you best prepare yourself for that? By going to the Beis HaMedrash, the Beis HaKnesset. By learning and imbuing yourself with Torah, and then it's that Das Torah that is able to guide and lead the people and to make the right decisions. And that, says Rabbi Roberts, is the explanation of the Medrash. When you used to go into that room there in Sinclair Grove, I'm sure you did it. First of all, whatever time of night, you went past late at night, the lights were always on. You went past, you came back from a wedding, you came back from a holiday, it was late at night. At the Hesped, on Sunday, one of the sons said that one of the caterers in the community, didn't say which one, he'd come back late from Chasnas, the caterer is the last guy to leave, and he would drive past Sinclair Grove. He said there was always one light on in Golders Green, in the front room. And I remember speaking once to the neighbours separately, who lived opposite. They said that light in the front room was on to the early hours every night. It's okay to do it Shavuos night and do it here and there, but to do it night after night, week after week, year after year, is impressive. And you go in there, and he was someone, another Rav in the community told me, he said for him, Rabbi Roberts was his compass. That was the benchmark. That was the compass. And it's the principles that he felt, held very hard. He took a very sort of unbending stance, and he was a very principled person. But it was because of the Torah that he was learning. There was that imbued him with that Das Torah. Okay, let's press on. Now, the Parsha, of course, the mainstay of the Parsha is the Tochacha. There's the good part, the bad part. The good part starts in Bechukosai telechu ves mitzvosai tishmu vasisim osam, and the good part finishes off va'oilech eschem komemius. That's how the good part of the Parsha begins and ends. Then it says ve'im lo sishmuli, if you don't listen, ve'lo sasu es kometz v'oile, etc., etc. And then the dozens of psukim which tell the terrible forewarning of all the punishments that will and unfortunately have happened to Klal Yisrael. And then it finishes off, okay. Now, I once heard this from a friend of mine, Simon Bam. He said something fabulous. If you think about it, the good part of the Teichacha begins with the letter Aleph, Im Bechukosai tishmu, telechu, and then it finishes with a Tov, with a Sof, Va'oilech eschem komemius. In other words, it goes from A to Z. In the good times, there's clarity. There's a Seder, it begins with A, it finishes with Z, it goes from Aleph to Tov. But when things are bad and things go crazy and your world implodes, then you think it's all random. Where's HaKadosh Baruch Hu? There's no method, it's all crazy. But if you look carefully, it begins with a Vov, Ve'im lo sishmuli, and it finishes Bahar Sinai biyad Moshe with a Hey. In other words, it begins with, imagine the Aleph base written out. It goes with Vov, it goes to the end of the Aleph base, goes round again, Aleph to Hey, and then it finishes there. There is a method, but it's not always easily detectable. In good times, it's A to Z, Aleph to Tov. In bad times, it seems like there's no method. There is a method. It's just that you can't quite see it. So I'll tell you a story that he once, this is what I once heard from him. He said a few things. He told a story, first of all. A story of a lady in Cholon. She was a secular lady, a Chiloni lady, who had come to Bnei Brak. This is in the 1960s. And sadly, she got run over and she died in Bnei Brak. And she had no family. She had no descendants. And she was a Meis Mitzvah. The trouble was, it was the time of the autopsy scandal. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but in that time, in the 50s, 60s, there was a sad chapter in Jewish history, and they would harvest a lot of organs from bodies against their will, they not knowing, without consent, and against halacha. And therefore, when this lady had died, the authorities wanted to take her in, but the people of the yeshiva world were concerned that they were going to take her organs against her permission, etc., without her consent. and therefore they refused to give over the body. So there was this standoff that, they didn't want to release the body, and the authorities wanted to take the body, and they sent more police, and you can imagine more Bachrim came to the yeshiva, and it became quite a standoff. And as things escalated, everyone started hearing and talking about it, until eventually, after a day or two, it quietened down, and they agreed, they compromised, whatever, they buried this lady. But by this time, it was major news, and this lady had the most fabulous send-off. It was a huge levaya with the great Rosh Hashivas and the great Rebbes of the time. Now, after the levaya, someone went into the stipler, lived in Bnei Brak, and said, why? What did this woman do to deserve this great levaya? All the Rosh Hashivas, all the Rebbes of the time were escorted her on her final journey. And the stipler says, he was wondering the same thing himself. And he was discussing it with his wife, and his wife said that she remembered this lady from pre-war Europe, and she had come from family, and she was in the ghettos during the war, and she remembered this lady was Moshe Nefesh. She would go out, people were dying on the streets, and she would do whenever she could, would bury them with her own hands, and would make sure they would have Kvurus Yisrael. So we don't know how HaKadosh Baruch Hu works, but it could be that as a midah keneged midah, as a schar for her unbelievable Mesiras Nefesh, that maybe she also had Kvurus Yisrael in a very honorable way. Rabbi used to say, we say this, I think, in the Piyutim. There are lots of midrashim about it, but this particular nusach, I think, is in the Piyutim in Yom Kippur, where we say that when Rabbi Kiva was tortured to death and killed, the Malachim were protesting and saying, Zu Torah v'zu schar. How can that be? So the Medrash says, Shasoik, be quiet, otherwise I'll take you back to Tohu v'vohu, I'll destroy the world. So the normal understanding of that is that if you don't be quiet, I'll just destroy the world. But Rabbi said that's not pshat. What it means is that imagine you're coming onto, you're looking at a painting. You're looking at a painting and your nose is 1/4 of an inch away from the canvas. So you can't see anything. You've got to take 10 steps back and you see, wow, this magnificent painting. There's a movie. And you're watching a movie and you're seeing, and all of a sudden, you come into, in the middle of the movie, and one guy hits another guy. And you say, that's not fair, what did he do wrong? So the people watching the movie say, yeah, but you didn't see what happened before. To understand exactly, you've got to rewind the video, see the whole movie from the beginning. That's pshat. Take the world back to Tohu v'vohu means you've got to rewind the whole video back to the 6 days of creation and see the whole thing unfold. And once you've seen that whole perspective, then you can understand. So he's saying to the Malachim, you've got to see the whole perspective. Shasoik, otherwise I'm going to have to turn the world back to Tohu v'vohu. Okay. Then you have a very strange posuk in the beginning of the Parsha. Perek Chavov, posuk Yud Aleph. Take a look at paragraph 3. If you're listening online, please email me at j.golker@gmail.com. I'll send you the handout. Says the pasuk, "V'nosati mishkani b'seichechem, v'lo yisigel nafshi eschem." Now this is in the good part, that you listen to my mitzvahs and you'll have all wonderful brachas. And I'll give you my v'nosati mishkani. Rashi says that means the Beis Hamikdash. And then it says, "V'lo yisigel nafshi eschem," and my soul won't become despised, won't be disgusted by you. That's a very strange thing to say. The way Rabbi Franz says it over, he quotes the Shemen HaTov, but he says it over in his inimitable style. He says, imagine a husband is writing the sort of an anniversary card to his wife, and he's saying, roses are red, violets are blue, that my love for you is, I can't think of it doesn't rhyme, I'm not a good poet on the spot, but, his love is, but I won't be disgusted by you. That's hardly a romantic thing to say in a card. I won't be disgusted, but that's what Kodesh Baruch Hu is saying. This is in the good part of the Parsha, that things are going to be so wonderful that I won't be disgusted by you. What does that mean? So the Shemen HaTov gives a beautiful explanation. A husband and wife potentially have the closest relationship, more than any other relationship. That's the positive. The downside is, if things don't work out, it can be the most contentious and difficult and painful relationship. And you speak to any probate lawyer, and they'll tell you 100 stories about that. That if Rahman Islam, it doesn't work out, it can be disastrous. And therefore, as the Gemara says in Sanhedrin, which Mamish brings out this point, Hahu is Sanhedrin Zayin Amud Aleph. Hahu dava kama v'azil. The person would say, Ki rachmisen hava aziza. When our love was strong for each other, apusyot safsira shechivan. We could live together on the edge of a knife, on a very thin point. Hashta dela aziz rachmimosa. Now things aren't so good. Puria bar shisin garmidi lo sagilon. A bed of 60 amas wide is not big enough. Right? That's exactly the point. You know what Kodesh Baruch Hu is saying? we're going to have an amazingly close relationship. And no matter how bad things may get, I'm never going to reject you. I'm never going to be disgusted by you. That's an amazing bracha. Because it has the potential for fallout, but it's never going to get that far. That's an amazing bracha. So just a story that I heard from, I forget who I heard it from, when Rebbetzin Roberts, who passed away a few years ago, when she was unwell, and she went to the Beanstalk home in the care home in Manchester. And so Rabbi Roberts would go every day to visit her. And one time he said, let's go outside or get some fresh air. So they go for a walk outside, and she was very frail, her walking was very poor. So he would, as they were going out, he held on to her arm, and he said, come, let's go out. And as they went outside, she let go of his arm and said, no. So he said, but you're free. He goes, no, better not. So she walked unaided to the bench, and they sat there. So he said, so why don't you want to, your walking is poor, let me hold you. So she said, look, don't you realize there are people around here, a lot of almonas, a lot of ladies who are widowed, and for them to see a husband and wife holding hands together is too painful for them. Imagine? An amazing thing. Anyway, I thought of that story as I said the Vod. Good, let's finish off. Okay, this is very interesting. Very interesting and a beautiful idea, two ideas. What is the end of the Techacha, which is towards the end of the Parsha, before we get to Chazak, at the very end of the Parsha, we have the Parsha of Erechin. Now, Erechin, what is Erechin? It's an interesting Parsha, it's a whole Masechta in Shas. Erechin is basically tzedakah. You're making pledges to give money to the Beis HaMikdash. So you say, the Lashon is, Eirech Olai, that you point at a person, and you say, his or her value, I'm going to give to the Beis HaMikdash. How much do you give? The Torah sets it out. It depends if it's male, female, and it depends on the age. And basically there are 8 permutations. You can see I've written it in the box there. Yeah, between the ages of 0 and 5, the male is 5, woman 3, 20, 10, etc., etc. The question everyone asks is, why here? Why is the Parsha of Erechin straight after the Teichacha and Parsha Bechukosai? If it's to do with the Mishkan, then its natural location would be in the first half of Sefer Vayikra. Why is it here straight after the Teichacha? So there's 2 ideas that I've seen. The first is the Balaturim. So let's take a look. Before we do the Balaturim, let's do this famous Gemara. The Gemara says in Shabbos Kuf Nun Vav on the base. Listen to this amazing Gemara. Rabbi Kiva Havyele Barta. Rabbi Kiva had a daughter, Omrile Kaldoi, and this astrologer said to Rabbi Kiva, Hahu Yoim Edayle Lebeginna, the day that she gets married, Torik La Chivya Umeisa, she'll be bitten by a snake and she's going to die. Havadaiga Amilsa Tuva, Rabbi Kiva was petrified. He was very worried. Never, his daughter's going to die on the day of the wedding. Hahu Yoim Meshakvata Lemechabta, what that day the wedding came, and after the wedding, she was taking off her head covering, and the way it worked in those days, you didn't have cupboards. You had I've been to one of these Mishnaic homes, and you can go still see them in the north of Israel, in Tzipori and these places. Yeah, they're tiny, right? And you've got these brick walls or stone walls, and she wanted to take off her head covering, so she put like a pin into the wall, and that's going to be a peg to hold it. So says the Gemara, Tarik Lachio Misa, when she put the brooch or whatever it was, this pin through the stone wall, the little hole in the wall, there was a snake behind, and she killed the snake. Says the Gemara, Safra, the next morning, when she took the pin out, there was a snake which has been embedded on this thing. So Amala Avua, the father, then she showed up at the first Shev Brachas. Can you imagine? Amala Avua, my avadata. I wasn't expecting to see you here. Amrele, tell me what you did. You must have done a good deed, because he must have told her what happened. This is what the astrologer said to me. So he said, you must have done a good deed. My avadata, what did you do? Amrele, so she said to him, but Panya Osa Anya, yesterday at the Chasna, a poor person came along. Kora Baba, he knocked on the door. Everyone was busy at the wedding. So no one paid attention. No one answered the door. No one heard him. Ka'imna, I stood up. Shokalti l'ristenoi diavesli, I took the portion of food that was given to me. Yahavteni hali, and I gave it to this poor man. Amalah, so Rabbi Kiva said, mitzvah vadata, what a tremendous thing you did. Nofak Rabbi Kiva v'dorash v'tzedakah tatzlamim, famous Gemara, the tzedakah saves a person from death. Says the Balaturim, amazing Balaturim on this pasuk. Dabel b'nei Yisrael v'maratu aleim ish ki yafli neder b'erkach nafshas Hashem, and tomorrow in this week's Parsha. Says the Balaturim, b'Parshas Erchin yesh nun shkolim v'lamed shkolim v'chov shkolim, etc., etc. There are all these numbers, 8 permutations of amounts that you give when you pledge money to the Beis Hamikdash. Says the Balaturim, shehu sach hakol kuf mem gimel shkolim. You add up those 8 figures, you get a total of 143 shkolim. 90 plus 53. Why 143? Lechaper al memhei klolish shebetoras kohanim v'tzadiches shebemishnah Torah. There are 2 teichachos. One is in Parshas Bechukosai, this week's Parsha. One is in Kisovo. One has 98 curses in Kisovo, and this week's Parsha has 45. 45 and 98, 143. Shehem bein hakol kuf mem gimel. V'lekach somach erchin leklolos. In other words, to counteract, to negate the 143 curses, the total curses of the Teichacha in Parshat Bechukosai and Kisava 143, we have 143 shkolim in total to balance them out, to counteract them. Stoka tatzlam imoves. That's why the Parsha of Erchin is placed straight after the Teichacha. Fine, that's what the Balaturim says. So I once heard the following story, or Rabbi once said this on Kol Nidre night. Crazy story. There was a young Kollel family in Eretz Yisrael who were, things were very tight for them. And Thursday night, a guy knocks on their door asking for food for Shabbos. So the wife was out, the husband was home, and he felt terrible for this guy. A guy's coming knocking for food for Shabbos on Thursday night. He knew himself that they had very little food in the house. His wife had gone that week and bought 2 chickens, one they're using for Shabbos, one's in the freezer. So he figured he hasn't got much food available, but you know what? Maybe I should give the chicken which is in the freezer and give it to this guy. But then he thought, you know what, but a chicken's a chicken. That's next week's Shabbos. No, I'm going to give it to him. He goes to his freezer, standing freezer, he opens it up, and to his total shock and dismay, he opens his freezer, his 3-year-old kid spills out of the freezer. The background is that the kid had been playing hide and seek, had found an amazing hiding place a couple of minutes earlier, put himself in the freezer, closed it, suddenly got very cold, the suction kicked in, he couldn't push it open, and Nebuch, if the father wouldn't open the freezer, it would have been horrific, beyond horrific. At that moment, he had opened the freezer to put out the thing, so says the Balaturim, the connection of Erchin straight after the Teichacha is to teach me that the way to counter the Teichacha, the klolos of Toras Kohanim, and Bechukosai and Kisovo is through tzedakah, 143 against 143. Okay, one final idea, and this, again, a well-known idea. They quote Rav Moshe Shera. Rav Moshe Shera, again, we quoted him earlier, the famous leader of Agudas Yisrael in America in recent times. He would say the following. What does it mean, erech? Erech means value, the worth. It's a horrible phrase in English. You point at someone and you say, what's that guy worth? As if the money in his bank account has any bearing on his true worth, right? But that's what we say. The true worth of a person, says Rav Moshe Shera, is how he responds to difficulties. The Parsha of Erchin is put straight after the Teichacha because the way in which a person responds to a time of difficulty, that's his true erech. And the famous story they tell of the Satmar Rebbe. So the Satmar Rebbe, and I've used this many times in school, and whenever a survivor comes in, unfortunately it's getting harder and harder to find survivors, but when a survivor comes in, I often end off with this. When I thank them, I then tell the following story. The Satmar Rebbe, Rabbi Yoel Teitelbaum, lived in America in Williamsburg, but he was in Eretz Yisrael, I think it was in the 1970s, and before he was going back to America, his Hasidim said, so where are we going to go for a bracha? You're going back to America, where are we going to go to for a bracha? So famously, the Satmar Rebbe said to them, you go to shul in the morning. This is in the 1970s, it was a very common sight. Any Jew who lifts up his sleeve, when he's putting on tefillin, he sees a tattoo there, which invariably means he was in Auschwitz, you get a bracha from them. If they're still putting tefillin on, after they've been through what they've been through, you get a bracha from them. Which is mamash this. The erech of a person is best ascertained after he's been through what he's been through, and that's the true measure of a person. Roberts in the Hesped, it was interesting because they said Nebuch in the last few months he suffered and his breathing was very, very difficult for him. And they heard him under his breath, he would say, he would be muttering, Kol man da'ovid rachmana l'tavovid. Whatever HaKadosh Baruch Hu does is for the best. Now that comes from a Gemara in Brachos. Look at the bottom box. Tanya Mishmei Rabbi Kiva, La'olam ye'odem lo'ima rogel kol da'ovid rachmana l'tavovid. Famous Gemara. Now, it's interesting because it's La'olam ye'odem rogel lo'ima, which means that a person should accustom himself to say it. So when they said that at the Hesped, I had a flashback. But I remember once Rabbi Roberts, I remember speaking to him afterwards, and a few times afterwards speaking to him about this. He once told the following story of Rabbi Aaron Kotler. Rabbi Aaron Kotler in his last days also was suffered, and he was in a lot of pain. And one of the Talmidim went in to him, and he was suffering, and he said to Rabbi Aaron, he says, Zolzain good, it's going to be okay. Yeah, so Rabbi Aaron was agitated, and he said back to the guy, he brought him near, and he says, what do you mean Zolzain good? Is yet's good. Now it's good. In other words, the Yisurim now, good, the Mechape, it's good. Not it's going to be good, it is good now. And I remember, and Rabbi Roberts, that's what he meant. Kol man da'ovid rachmana l'tavovid, and he would say that it's Mechape, and that was because he was La'olam ye'odem rogel lo'ima. He would say it in his lifetime. I heard it from him. And he lived by it. And that's how he died by it as well. So, there we have it. 4 ideas from Parsha Bechukosai, toiling in Torah, that very interesting idea that David HaMelech says that my legs would take me because it's through Limud HaTorah that gave him the ability to guide, the method in the madness, Aleph to Tov, but also in the bad times there's a method, sometimes not always so clear and so visible, the strange blessing of V'lo sigol nafshi eschem, that actually it's a big bracha, a tremendous bracha. And what is the connection between the Teichoch and Erechin? Either stoka tatzim imoves, or measuring the true value. The true value of a person is how he responds to difficulties. Say that.